Imagine a cold February night in 1978 when 5 young men vanished without a trace. What began as a carefree trip to a basketball game soon spiraled into one of the most perplexing and tragic mysteries in American criminal history. Months later, their bodies were discovered deep in the remote forests of Northern California. Under circumstances so strange and unsettling, they continue to baffle investigators and haunt the public to this day. Why was their car abandoned in the middle of nowhere? What were they trying to escape? And what truly happened during the final hours of their lives? This is the chilling story of the Yuba County Five, often referred to as America's Dyatlov Pass incident. On the evening of February 24, 1978, 5 young men from Yuba County, California, set out to attend a basketball game in Chico. Their names were Gary Mathias, 25, Jack Madruga, 30, Ted Wire, 32, Bill Sterling, 29, and Jack Hewitt, 24. The 5 were close friends and members of a basketball team called the Gateway Gators, composed of individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Although all of them were adults, several had the mental maturity of children. Gary Mathias had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but was considered stable while on medication. He had served in the U.S. Army, but was discharged after experiencing a severe psychological episode. Jack Madruga, also a former serviceman, was known to be slow in processing information. He was the driver that night, operating his 1969 Mercury Montego. Ted Wire and Bill Sterling were known to have the cognitive abilities of children. Wire had worked at a snack bar for a time but quit after his family became concerned the job was too stressful for him. Sterling was deeply religious and often read Bible verses to patients in the hospital. Jack Hewitt was shy, had difficulty navigating social situations, and was especially close to Ted Wire. The two were considered inseparable. After attending the basketball game in Chico, the 5 men stopped at a small convenience store where they picked up snacks, milk, and soft drinks. It was already late, and a light snowfall had begun. But instead of driving home, they headed in the opposite direction, into the remote wilderness of the Plumas National Forest. The night passed, morning arrived, but the 5 friends never came home. What at first seemed like a simple delay quickly turned into deep concern. Worried parents began calling one another, searching for explanations, hoping someone had heard something, anything, but no one had. As the hours passed, unease turned into fear. Eventually, the families contacted the police. From the very beginning, it was clear to investigators that something was off. These weren't the kind of men who simply vanished. They lived quiet, structured lives. Most evenings were spent at home with their families. Only Gary Mathias occasionally went out with older friends, but even that had its limits. Nothing about that night fit the pattern. Police issued a missing persons alert. Not long after, the first witnesses came forward. In Chico, several people recalled seeing the group at the basketball game. A clerk at a small convenience store remembered the men stopping by just before closing time to pick up a few things: milk, candy, soda, simple items for the drive home. And then they disappeared once more, just as the first snow began to fall and cover the roads. Lieutenant Lance Ayers was in charge of the search. But for him, it was more than just a case. He knew the young men, especially Ted Wire and his brothers. He'd gone to school with them. Their faces were familiar. Their disappearance struck him on a deeply personal level. Determined, he devoted himself fully to finding them. For Ayers, this had long stopped being a routine investigation. It felt as though the fate of the 5 young men had imprinted itself on every part of his life. Their absence haunted him. Each morning began with the hope of a breakthrough. Each night ended in the same aching silence. Days became weeks, and the uncertainty gnawed at him without end. Working alongside the families of the missing men, Ayers explored every possible lead. They distributed flyers, interviewed residents in towns and remote communities, and offered a reward for credible information. The phone at the police station rang constantly. Reports came in from across California and beyond. People claimed to have seen the men in places like San Francisco, Arizona, even as far as Florida and Canada. Each time, a flicker of hope rose, only to be extinguished by disappointment. Most of the tips were vague, inconsistent, or outright false. A heavy sense of frustration settled over the investigation. But he couldn't stop. Not as long as there was still a chance the men were out there, somewhere. Ayers felt increasingly helpless. Just as hope was beginning to slip away, and the families prepared themselves for the worst, the unexpected happened. A call came in. This time, it was different. A discovery in the mountains. Something had finally pierced the long silence. But what Ayers and the families would soon uncover was far more disturbing than anything they could have imagined. As the search shifted toward the remote Feather River region, no one yet realized how deep this mystery would go, or how dark its ending would be. On February 28th, police located the Mercury Montego on a remote, snow-covered mountain road, roughly 70 miles from Chico. The car was parked neatly, not stuck, and had enough fuel to make the return trip. The keys were missing, but officers confirmed the vehicle was fully functional. Inside, they found remnants of the snacks the men had purchased, along with 4 road maps, carefully folded and placed in the glove compartment. Despite an extensive search, the men were nowhere to be found. As heavy snowfall continued and conditions worsened, authorities were forced to suspend the search until spring. On June 4th, 1978, when most of the mountain snow finally melted, a group of motorcyclists came across a trailer on an abandoned campsite. It belonged to a remote outpost of the U.S. Forest Service. These types of facilities were common in the region. Numerous similar stations were spread across the area, strategically positioned to support rescue missions, search operations, or wildfire monitoring. While many of these stations were staffed regularly, the more remote ones were often left unused and activated only when necessary, as had been the case with this particular site the previous fall. The men had been out all day and decided to take a break. But as they removed their helmets, they were hit by a heavy, sickly sweet stench that clung to the thick, stagnant air. 2 of them recognized it immediately, the unmistakable scent of decay. At first, they assumed the obvious, a dead animal, decomposing nearby under the summer sun, but the strength of the smell made the men pause and furrow their brows. Another had to fight back a wave of nausea. For a brief moment, they considered turning back, leaving this ominous place behind. But before the group could make a decision, one of the men spotted a broken window on the large trailer nearby. Curiosity and unease began to intertwine. Cautiously, he stepped closer to peer inside. At first glance, everything seemed completely normal. A few cabinets and work surfaces looked as if the place had been abandoned long ago and left untouched ever since. But something wasn't right. A strange, creeping unease crawled up his spine. He hesitated, then placed his hand on the doorknob. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. A brief flicker of doubt. Then he gently pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and stagnant, saturated with the same sickly sweet stench that had already clung to the air outside. The room was cloaked in dim light. A soft, persistent buzzing of flies broke the silence. He moved slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dark. At the back of the trailer, on a bed, he saw a figure, still wrapped in several blankets up to the neck. The face was gaunt, the skin gray. Insects swarmed the body. The scene felt unreal, as if time inside this place had simply stopped. A chill crept down his spine. As he instinctively stepped back, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew instantly. This wasn't just a grim discovery. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't an accident. And deep down, he felt it was only the beginning of something much darker, a mystery that would follow them for a long time. When authorities arrived a short time later, they already carried a sense of foreboding, one that would soon prove to be tragically accurate. The body was identified as one of the 5 young men who had vanished on that cold February night. The following day, police discovered the body of Jack Madruga, roughly 11 miles from the trailer near the road that led back toward the car. His remains had been disturbed by animals. His body had been partially mutilated by animals. His eyes and 2 fingers were missing. Nearby, scattered bones were later identified as those of Bill Sterling. 2 days after that, Jack Hewitt's father made a grim discovery. His son's spine, located about 2 miles northeast of the trailer. Later, his skull was found and identified through dental records. To this day, Gary Mathias remains missing. His shoes were discovered inside the trailer, suggesting that he had been there. It's believed he may have put on Ted Wyer's larger shoes after his own feet became swollen. Investigators tried to reconstruct the final, desperate hours of the 5 men, but the evidence revealed a story filled with holes and haunting contradictions. Maybe it happened like this. As the snowfall grew heavier and the cold swallowed all visibility, the men sat stranded in the car, uncertain, confused. At some point, they must have made a decision to leave the safety of the vehicle behind. But why? Did one of them panic? Or did they believe help was nearby? They left the Montego behind and stepped out into the dark, frozen wilderness. They set out, heading in the wrong direction. There was no road that would take them home. Instead, they struggled for miles through rough, mountainous terrain. Hours passed. Their feet sank into the snow, the frost biting at their limbs. But eventually, they reached the Forestry Service trailer, a hut, a place of refuge. Here, they could have been safe. There was food, blankets, a propane tank for heat, but none of it was used. Only Ted Wyer remained, wrapped in blankets as his body slowly decayed. His feet were frostbitten, his body emaciated. Why didn't they search the cabinets for food? Why didn't they light a fire, even though matches and paper were available? Maybe Wyer was already too weak. Maybe Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt set out to find help. Maybe Mathias stayed behind to look after Ted, but no one ever came back. Later, search teams found blankets and a flashlight just a few hundred yards from the trailer, as if Mathias had gone out looking for the others. One question continued to haunt investigators and families alike. What had led the 5 men into such a remote, unforgiving mountain region? The narrow, winding road through the snowy forest didn't lead home. But to this day, no trace of him has ever been found. The winding road through the snowy woods wasn't the way home. It was a route none of them knew, one they never would have taken by choice. Why then had they ended up there? Jack Madruga's mother was convinced. Something had chased them, something that drove them into the darkness of the mountains. But what, or who, could have terrified 5 strong grown men so completely? Even with their mental challenges, they were tough, and together they would have been difficult to overpower. Who, or what, could have posed such a threat? And even if they were running from someone, why abandon the car? It was fully functional, not stuck, and had plenty of fuel. It was in working condition, not stuck, and had plenty of gas in the tank. Why push themselves for miles through snow and cold, only to reach a trailer, a place that could have saved them, and still not survive? Why did they choose to venture into the freezing wilderness on foot? The trailer could have saved them. Inside were blankets, enough food for months, matches, and a working propane tank. Yet none of it was used. Was it panic? Or was someone, or something, out there waiting in the dark? Some believed the men's mental impairments had left them helpless that night. Maybe they couldn't fully grasp the situation. Maybe they panicked. But that explanation seemed too simple and didn't fit with everything known about the group. Gary Mathias had served in the Army, as had Jack Madruga. Both had received basic military training. They should have known how to survive in the wilderness, how to respond in an emergency. So why did they perish in such a desperate, disoriented way? The discovery of the first bodies sent a wave of unease through the investigation. Was it truly just a tragic chain of events? Or was there something more? Whispers of foul play began to spread. Then a witness came forward, one whose account briefly cast the entire investigation in a different light. His name was Joseph Shones. On June 2, 1978, he contacted police and spoke with Lieutenant Ayers. What he described was unsettling, and perhaps the missing key to the mystery. On the night the 5 men vanished, February 24th, Joseph Shones was driving along the same mountain road where the Montego would later be found. His Volkswagen Beetle became stuck in the snow. While trying to free it, he suffered a mild heart attack. He remained trapped for hours, alone in the freezing cold, unable to call for help. Around 2 a.m., Shones suddenly heard strange sounds, whistling, voices. Then he saw lights. Peering out the window of his car, he spotted several figures moving in the darkness. Men and a woman cradling a baby. They were briefly illuminated by the headlights of a car about 100 feet away. Shones called out for help, but their reaction was strange. They froze. Then, without responding, they turned and hurried back to their vehicle. The headlights faded, and the darkness swallowed everything. All that remained was the cold, oppressive silence of the night. But it wasn't over. Later that night, Shones again heard footsteps, whistling, voices, and saw lights once more. But he couldn't make out anyone. It was as if something unseen was moving through the darkness. Around 5 a.m., his car ran out of gas. The engine, the only thing keeping him warm, shut down. Shones had no choice. He began the long walk, 8 miles, or about 13 kilometers, to the nearest lodge. He dragged himself through the biting cold of the night. At some point, he passed a car parked at the side of the road, the Montego. He didn't recognize it and paid it no attention. He couldn't have known that just days later, this vehicle would stand at the center of one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history. Shones's account seemed to echo rumors that had already begun to circulate. There were reports of an argument in the parking lot at Chico State University, where the 5 men were allegedly harassed by strangers. Others claimed to have seen them in a cabin near Brownsville, trying to use a phone. But none of these leads led anywhere. Every clue seemed to dissolve into dead ends. Even Shones's experience became just another puzzle piece that refused to fit the bigger picture. It remained a disturbing suggestion, but no answer. And yet, what if the truth was even darker? In 2017, nearly 40 years after the men vanished, a disturbing report surfaced online. A woman, claiming to be the sister-in-law of Jack Hewitt, published details that had never been made public before. According to her, the 5 friends witnessed something that night at the basketball stadium, something they weren't supposed to see. She claimed they saw a heated altercation between a woman and several men. When they tried to intervene and help her, things spiraled out of control. The men, she claimed, had been threatened. Gary Mathias was allegedly pushed off a bridge during the confrontation, his body never found because it had fallen into a deep ravine. The remaining 4 friends, gripped by panic, fled in terror. Blinded by fear, they ran into the mountains in the dark and became hopelessly lost. One final detail would later raise eyebrows among investigators. Spent shell casings were found near the entrance to that remote mountain road. Had someone opened fire on the men? Could it be that they were desperately trying to escape something or someone? Were they really running for their lives? But then another question emerged. How does their calm visit to the store fit into this picture? How does buying snacks align with the idea of fleeing in fear? Were there 2 separate incidents, or did the chase begin only after they left the store? Questions upon questions and not a single clear answer. Instead of clarity, more and more theories began to emerge. Some speculated that Gary Mathias had suffered a psychotic break and forced his friends up the mountain road. Others believed they had been abducted. And then there were those who spoke of something even stranger, supernatural forces. Parallels were drawn to the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia, where people also fled into the frozen wilderness, abandoning their camp in panic, only to be found dead under mysterious circumstances. This case, too, remains unsolved to this day. The similarities are unsettling. Both cases took place in February. In both, the victims left a place of relative safety and wandered into deadly cold. They became separated, died of exposure, and to this day, no one knows why. And so, the mystery of the Yuba County Five remains unsolved. The truth about their final hours is still buried somewhere out there, in the snowy forests of Northern California, hidden beneath a blanket of snow and years. What led the 5 men into those dark mountains, far from the road that would have taken them home? Was it fear, a sudden psychological break, or a threat no one will ever truly understand? The traces they left behind raise only questions, no answers. The cold they faced wasn't just the chill of the wilderness, but the colder, lingering weight of not knowing, a weight still carried by their families and by those who tried to find the truth. Perhaps one day the truth will come to light. Perhaps we'll finally understand what really happened that night. But until then, we're left with the memory of 5 friends who vanished into the woods and the unsettling truth that some mysteries may never be solved. And so, the pain lives on, sustained by the one question that still echoes. Why? What do you think? Do you have your own theory about what might have happened that night?